Okay, so we are going to move now to, I'm going to go back over here to sharing my screen. We're going to go now into shorter speakers. We've had a set of that was a larger workshop because she really wanted Marisha to really have that time to frame this up. And we do have a focus on food and diversity. And for us, this, how do we meet our basic needs right now? And so I'm going to introduce Nicki Youngsma, who's writer, artist, and editor with the Home Orchard Society. And so you get to now, you'll be able to share your screen, the Agro-Biodiversity in context of food security. Yes, please teach us about food security.
Thank you for that introduction. My name is Nicki Youngsma, and I'm happy to be here, and thank you all for being here too. I'll be moving through my presentation quickly, just as a heads up. So I'm going to be talking today about agrobiodiversity in the context of food security. And first of all, I'm going to talk about what agrobiodiversity is and how to think of it in a modern context. I'm also going to lay out 4 cases and a case study in support of agrobiodiversity. Then I'll identify current threats to conservation efforts. And lastly, I'll leave you with actions that people can take to get involved in this work. So to start off, most people, here I'm just waiting for my screen to, there's a delay in getting it to go through the slides. So to start off, a lot of people go to the grocery store to get food. A lot of grocery stores have setups that are similar to this. They're very large buildings. They have aisles full of packaged and canned food. You can get bananas, oranges, and apples any time of the year. So one might ask, what's the issue with food security when this is what you see? And what's the problem? So to answer that, I'd say that there is a lot absence. There's a lot of things that are absent from the store, and this picture here does not represent the breadth of ancestral human foods. So go ahead and advance. So past and present, human beings have sourced food from different landscapes through different parts of the world at different points in time. And it's estimated that between 5,000 to 70,000 plant species have fed human beings worldwide. That has changed dramatically within the last 100 years or so. And now, depending on how you count, between 30 to 103 plant species feed humans today. And the juggernauts of this list are the cereal crops, maize, which is also known as corn, wheat, and rice. It's estimated that 1 in 3 plant-derived calories come from these 3 plant species alone. Go in advance. So agrobiodiversity is a term that specifically identifies biodiversity within human food systems. And that includes, but isn't limited to, these somewhat overlapping categories of conventional food crops, livestock, wild gene pools, and first foods. My presentation is going to focus today on conventional food crops. So agrobiodiversity is in trouble today because 90% of heirloom varieties of food crops in the United States, at least, are considered extinct now. So when you look at this pie chart, you see this orange wedge here, and that represents what food crops remain today, and the rest that have been cultivated in time are now either extinct or lost. So there's varieties of things like cucumbers and apples and broccoli, for example, that don't exist anymore. And so when you go to Safeway, what you're seeing is just a fraction of what's in that orange wedge, and everything else is gone. You're not seeing anything that's in that peach zone when you go to Safeway. So the next, a question someone might ask would be like, well, how did that happen? And then you could advance the slide. We can see that that's, the rise of industrialized agriculture. So in the years following World War II, farming changed a lot. These changes included using synthetic inputs. It included heavy machineries. It also included a practice called monoculturing, in which farmers would plant not a diverse array of crops and plant species, but instead focus on planting one thing alone. And this was a huge departure from how farming had ever been practiced in the past. Since then, government farm policies have been shaped to support industrialized agriculture. Go ahead and advance the slide. So the next question might be, okay, like why is less agrobiodiversity really bad? Because I can, at the end of the day, I can still go to the store, I can still go to Safeway, I can get, food to feed myself. So I will present the cases of nutrition, food allergies, climate change, and pests to support why agrobiodiversity is important. Go ahead and advance the slide. So first of all, human beings, just like any creature, needs nutrition in order to survive and thrive. And nutrition in the form of micronutrients and macronutrients are sourced primarily from food. So different crop species like apples, raspberries, and potatoes, for example, they all have different nutritional profiles from each other. And what's also important is they also have their varieties of each of these species have their own distinct nutritional profiles too. So it's important to maintain a diverse array of crops, species, and their varieties in order to provide nutrition that supports optimum human health. Go ahead and advance the slide. The next case I'll talk about is food allergies. The rise of food allergies in the last 50 or so years is not well understood, and symptoms of food allergies can range anywhere between just general discomfort to anaphylaxis and death. So because of that, the Food Allergy and Labeling Consumer Protection Act of 2004 identifies 8 major food allergens that need to be bold-faced on ingredient lists on packaged food. So according to this legislation, things like peanuts or ingredients such as peanuts, dairy, eggs, wheat, soy, fish, tree nuts, and shellfish have to be bold-faced. So if you're not practiced at reading food labels, like for a dietary restriction, I encourage you to start doing that to just see how often these things appear in packaged foods. So the consequences of the homogenization of the human diet at large are not known at this point in time, and in reality, it's anomalous when looking at the historic trend of human diets at large. So with that, the impacts of eating a less diverse diet, which is what's happening now in many parts of the world, especially in industrialized countries, that impacts the microbiome, and that might be a contributing factor to food allergies. Go ahead and advance the slide. Another case for agrobiodiversity can be found in climate change. That's because extreme weather events such as storms or heat waves can ruin a harvest. In addition to that, some experts believe that agriculture climate zones are shifting, and that leads to question the viability of farming certain crops in certain places. And so with that, efforts to just, pick up and move crop production to a different locale, like further inland or further away from the equator, isn't as simple as that because soil types vary across the globe. And so although climate zones are changing, soil types are not. So that adds another layer of complexity when trying to cultivate food. So given the circumstances of climate change, maintaining a diverse array of crop species and their varieties is important for food security, since some might fare differently in various climate and or soil regions. Go ahead and advance. The last case I'll talk about today is that of pests, because just like people, plants also get sick from bacterial, fungal infections, and they also get eaten by insects, and all of those things impact harvest for human consumption. So different varieties of crops and different crop species have, they might be more or less resistant to certain kinds of pests, and that will lead us into our case study, which is on the next slide. The Irish potato famine of 1845 to 1849 is the case study we're going to look at, and this famine event was caused by continued failed harvests of potatoes due to a microorganism that made the blighted potatoes inedible. And although many countries were impacted by this pathogen, the Irish food system fared the worst because of their heavy reliance on a singular variety of potato that was the lumper potato. And a consequence of relying on one crop like this made the food system incredibly vulnerable to destabilization. So when that destabilization did come to pass, the result was death, starvation, malnutrition, and ultimately migration. So if you go ahead and go to the next slide, threats to conservation of agrobiodiversity remain. That is continued loss of plant diversity and species. That also includes just the loss of skills and knowledge, things like seed saving, grafting, plant propagation, and so on. And also it includes a practice or a topic called enclosure, which I'll talk about now. If you go ahead and advance the next slide, that is this is a historic example of enclosure about land in Ireland in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the colonization of Ireland at this point in time by the UK included land being taken out of communal holdings and transferred to the wealthy elite. And this transfer of land had really huge socioeconomic repercussions for the Irish people, because this enclosure process entrenched wealth disparities among ethnic and racial lines. And it also facilitated the monoculture practices of the potato, which ultimately led to weakness in the food system and paved the way to famine. On the next slide, we're going to talk about enclosure that's happening today, and that's the enclosure of living organisms. Essentially, what I'm talking about is the domination of agribusiness firms in the food system. So this figure here is another way to represent the loss of agrobiodiversity, but does so in relation to monopolization of seed stock. So as large firms dominate the market, they buy out seed companies, and which leads to the consolidation and privatization of seed stock. That erodes genetic diversity, because genetic diversity in the seed market doesn't serve the business models of such firms, like Monsanto, for instance. The enclosure of living organisms in this way is enforced through intellectual property instruments like patents. It's also enforced in license agreements, surveillance, and biotech. This enclosure really threatens food security because, as you can see in this diagram, as the market concentration takes place, there is less genetic diversity, which means there are less genetic resources from which to draw traits that might lend themselves well to drought resistance or pest resistance or nutritional elements. So in order to conserve what agrobiodiversity remains, you have to know where to find it. One place to start is supporting a small farm, and like buying a CSA share if that's what they offered, or if that farm offers that. One national CSA locator is Local Harvest. There are others, of course. Gardening is a great way to participate in agrobiodiversity conservation. Also shopping at small retailers like farmers markets, co-ops, food buying clubs. You are not going to find agrobiodiversity at supermarkets or online retailers. You're not going to find it in prepackaged foods, and you're not going to find it at most restaurants. So another way to get involved in this work is to participate with an organization and in political activism. So these are just some organizations in Oregon that I'm aware, that I've worked with and familiar with. Growing Gardens, Portland Fruit Tree Project, Real Wild Portland, Grow Portland, Home Orchard Society, Temple Orchard Conservancy, Friends of Family Farmers, Culinary Breeding Network. All of these participate in this work in some way. They all need people to get involved. They all need volunteers and skill sets. They need donations. And also I will emphasize that participating in activism is important, including that with officials, public officials and civil servants who work on farm policy. Things like the USDA Farm Bill and SNAP program, among others, shape how food is produced and also how food is consumed. So engaging on this front is another important piece to this. After all, the situation in which we find ourselves today is due in large part to the enabling factors of government farm policy. So in conclusion, if you find yourself feeling called to act on this issue in some way, and maybe that's buying a CSA share, maybe that's volunteering with an organization, or maybe that's even just trying a new food. So if you find yourself kind of daunted to take that first step, is what I invite you to do is to pause and to ask yourself, what's the risk of trying something new versus taking no action? Because the greatest risk of all is to do nothing. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to open it up to Q&A if there's time for that. I know we're over a little bit.
Yeah, we are actually a little over. I'm
Sure.
sorry about that. So,
No worries.
but if we can have time for questions, maybe we'll have our next speaker get queued up here, and then we can take a couple questions together. How does
Great.
that sound?
That's
Okay.
great. Thank you.